Hello, beautiful, lightful souls. My name is Tricia Barker, and I'm so excited to be here with Raymond Moody. He is the pioneer in near death experience research and coined the term near death experience. And he means a lot to me because in '94, when I had my near death experience in bed in a body cast, I picked up some of his books and I felt comforted and happy and really assured that at least there was this interest in what had happened to me, and I felt validated. And I know you've done that for so many near death experiencers. Have you felt that and heard that from experiencers over the years that they felt validated because of your work?
Yes, yes, that was very nice that so many people wrote and said that they had had such an experience, and it was good to hear somebody talking about it. And that actually goes for my medical school professors too. When I um, entered medical school in 1972, I had already been investigating this topic for 10 years. And so um, when I went to medical school, my friends that I'd known in medical and that when I was growing up had spread the word among the professors that this medical student was coming in September who uh, had had interviewed people with these experiences, and 8 of my professors in the first 2 weeks called me and thanked me and said either that they had had such experiences themselves or they had heard it from their patients. So
Isn't that
it was very.
amazing? Isn't that amazing how I find that when I tell my story publicly, a lot of people want to tell me their spiritual experiences or their shared death experiences? Do you find that people have wanted to come to you in mass and tell you their experiences?
Yes, and thank goodness for it. That is just it's a very nice thing. I mean, I've interviewed thousands and thousands of people with these experiences, and I really can't wait till the next one. It's
So,
always very exciting.
so I've heard you say that in an interview, maybe on Skeptico, that each time you hear a near death experience story, you get excited. I want to ask you a question though. Do you ever get frustrated with language's ability to capture and not capture things like telepathy or eternal love or these experiences that are such a reality for us during our near death experience, and we struggle with language to tell people about our experiences? I've even heard some near death experiencers say that they've heard their name on the other side and their name was not in English, not an intelligible, sound.
Oh, interesting. Well, yeah, that is the big problem because all over the world, no matter how articulate they may be, people say that they just can't put this into words. And we are on the way to a part resolution of that. For many, many years, I've been working on a system well, I would call it a logical system for how to think about transcendent experiences. And already thus far, basically, I think that by um, reworking our minds a little bit to think about things that are beyond the literal domain of language, that we can actually prepare people to articulate their experiences in an entirely new way. That has happened once already with a man that about 10 years, 8 years before had been to one of my seminars where I taught this method. And then on October 15th, 2015, he called me and he told me that he had had a near-death experience from a terrible illness he had, and realized when he was in that state of existence that, as he put it, I was right, that you've got to think of a whole different domain of language before we can really make sense of these things.
So
So that's on the way.
tell me
There are
more.
entirely new ways.
Tell me more about
Mm-hmm.
that, because when I can give you one little piece of my near death experience and you can tell me how
Good,
you
good.
might frame it in language. So
Uh-huh.
the angels, this is the beginning of my near death experience, and I don't even know if they're angels in the biblical sense. These large light beings sent
Hmm.
this energy through the back of my surgeons and into my body, and this energy and light that they were sending filled up my whole body on the operating table. And I knew that I would walk. I knew that the bone fragments would be picked out and that I would be fine. So this light was intelligence, it was healing, it was many things at once. It was so hard for me to describe what that
Yes.
was. So is there a
Yeah.
better way to describe that piece?
I think there is. The trouble is, it takes time. It basically what I would say is that we can reformat our minds to think about these things in an entirely new way. But it creates the difficulty that Plato was first described. And by the way, I was inspired in this work by Plato. I came
Yes.
I found out about the near death experiences when I was a philosophy student at the University of Virginia, and I read in Plato's Republic a story of a man who had what we would today call a near death experience. And I asked my professor about this, and he said that, yeah, these early Greek philosophers were interested in cases of people who had apparently died and been revived. And so I had known about it in that connection, but in 1965, 3 years later, I 3 years after I found out about it, I heard from one of my professors that in Charlottesville there was Dr. George Ritchie, who at that time was a professor of psychiatry at UVA, who had had such an experience. And in the spring of 1965, George Ritchie was the first living person I ever heard this from. And so when I heard it from George, to this day, George is the finest person I ever knew. He's just this really great human being. And the fact that, I mean, I could tell when I first heard him talk that he was for real. I mean, I didn't know what the explanation of this was, but I knew that George Ritchie was an honest and sincere man. And so that was really what got me started on this. And then when I was a professor of philosophy, I heard a lot of these from my students and fellow faculty members. So, and it was no big deal because by 1974, when I wrote that book, um, there were just so many people who had had this experience that knew full well that when it was published that anybody who would just put a little effort in trying to uh, verify or disconfirm what I said would soon realize that I was right on that, and that's what happened. It was
So I know
just
that.
within, yeah, I got a lot of letters from doctors just within those first few weeks saying that they had seen this in their patients too.
Interesting. So I had read that about your fascination with Plato's Republic, and I took a philosophy of the mind course as soon as I got to college, and I was an agnostic before I had my near death experience. So I I read all of this, was not convinced by philosophy, but I was convinced enough that I should remain open minded. And so I was an open minded agnostic before my near death experience. The first moments outside of my body, I was convinced because I felt and knew that I was experiencing a reality beyond this reality. Have you
Yeah,
heard that term many
yeah,
times
that's
from near
what
death
people say.
experiences?
Yeah, I think people who have not had such an experience tend to imagine that it might be dreamlike or like a dream.
Right.
But in fact, I'll say the opposite, that by comparison with the state of consciousness they reach when they leave their body and go into this light, that this world that we're in now is dreamlike. And
Yes.
I hear people say things like what they experienced was more real than real. It's
Yes.
hyper reality, as people describe it.
So
Yes.
are you convinced? I think I heard on one interview not too long ago that maybe you're not fully convinced of an afterlife. Are you convinced after hearing all these stories and all of these experiences from people? I mean, do you have an assurance about it?
Well, you will learn obviously in about 40 years here about being 70, and you learn at 70 that you're just finished with. I mean, I just say what is, and I'm not trying to be evasive here, but I can honestly tell you several things. Number one, yes, I do now accept that there's an afterlife. And secondly, that if you ask me, do I believe it, I'd have to say no, because, when you say you believe something, that implies to me that it's like you internalize it, right? Well, where I am with this is that I just give up. I don't know what else to say. I can't tell you that I've internalized it like a belief, but I don't know what else to say. For example, some years ago, now maybe 5, 6, 7 years ago, I um, was in Italy, and a surgeon came up to me after my lecture, and you could tell that he had been through something which had really changed him. And so basically, he told me that sometime before he had been doing an elective operation on a young man who actually was in good health overall, but in the surgery, the patient had a cardiac arrest, and the doctor wasn't able to revive him. So he was very upset. And at that point, the operating room door swung open, and a woman came in yelling. And at first, he thought she was psychotic, but as he listened to her, he realized she was saying, "My husband is not dead." And she said, "I was in the waiting room, and my husband came to me and said for me to come in here and tell you he's not dead."
Wow.
And the doctor resumed the resuscitation, and to his astonishment, the heart started beating again, and he was there when the patient regained consciousness. And he said, the patient told me, he said, "I was up above my body, seeing you down there, and I could tell you thought I was dead, but I kept trying to tell you I'm not dead, but you wouldn't hear me." And so I went out into the waiting area to try to tell my wife to come in here and tell you I'm not dead. And so, but I could give you many others like that.
Oh, that's an
But
amazing one.
it is, but I have many others like that where the doctors, in some way, empathically co-participated in their dying patients' near-death experiences. And so I just don't know what else to say. I have always realized that contrary to the common way we have of debating about this, actually the way we have of debating about it goes back to Plato and Democritus, who were roughly contemporaries. And Plato looked at these things and took them at face value as indicators of an afterlife, but Democritus, who had figured out that everything is made of atoms, explained it in those terms, that what we call a near-death experience, or what they studied, he thought was just a sign of some residual biological activity in the body. And that form of debate has been unchanged for 2,300 years. That's the way we talk, we argue and debate about it. And the trouble is that it's just totally off base, because the bystanders at the death of someone else very often have all of these elements that we identify as a near-death experience, and yet they are not ill or injured, so there's no oxygen cut off to their brains. So why,
Right.
you know,
The shared.
yeah, and so really, I kind of give up. I'm out of. I had always known that, because one of my own medical school professors in December of '72 or January of '73 had told me about her own experience as she was resuscitating her mother. She herself had no oxygen compromise to the brain, yet she had a florid near-death experience in the process of trying to resuscitate her own mother. So something else is going on here, and the trouble is we don't really have the logical categories to figure it out. You probably studied David Hume a little bit in your
Yes.
course, just a little bit. And, David Hume, I think, said it best. And Hume was a friend of Ben Franklin's, to date him for you, but he was a Scottish philosopher, and he pointed out that the logic we have and the mind we have is just not set up for thinking logically about life after death. But I say that Hume is absolutely right. But that nonetheless that we can fix that. That we have entirely new ways of thinking with genuine rational rigor about these big questions. Now, I want to know, incidentally, what did you end up studying? You studied philosophy of mind a little bit. What did you end up doing with your career?
That's a good part of my near death experience. So I was going to be a lawyer. I had my near death experience when I was a senior in college, and I had an English degree that I was about to complete with a minor in psychology. I did not want to be a teaching. I didn't want to go into teaching because that was too low paying. When I was in the afterlife and I went to that presence of God, I was told I had to come back and be a teacher, not a spiritual teacher,
A
an
teacher.
actual teacher. And I was like, no, God, no, no, no. So I argued with God in the afterlife, and God said, nope, you're going back, and these students need you. And it has been the most fulfilling career. So I've taught at all levels now at the college level, and I feel as if I am being worked through many times when I'm working with
Yeah.
students. And this is something that, as far as language goes, that I'm really curious about. So I saw the angelic beings working through my surgeons. My surgeons were totally not open to the other side, but they were great spinal surgeons, neurosurgeons, and they, especially Laura Flan, Dr. Laura Flan, she was kind of pioneering new things with backs and back surgery at that time. So I have this belief that we don't know how the afterlife and how these beings can work through us and when they're working through us. And you don't have to be this spiritual, like person necessarily to have them work through you. Maybe if you're just in motion. My surgeons were just in motion doing their job, and they were assisted from the other side. So there's so many ways to talk about this. I mean, have you thought that question through? Like people who say that they're very open to presences, and then people who say that they're not, but yet they still might be worked through.
Well, I agree with you that currently we have no way to think logically of how that happens. But I will say where I have come in my thought about this, Tricia, and I think it's probably not too far from what you've come up with, because a lot of people eventually reach this. And basically, to me, I think that, Elie Wiesel, he was a little before your time. You do
Oh,
know him,
yes, yes.
Elie,
Great writer.
a
Yeah.
great writer. And sadly, his books have sort of dropped out now, but he was just this great writer. And Elie was in the Auschwitz or camps and survived, and
Yes.
just a wonderful scholar and a wonderful man. And in one of Ellie's books, he says, God made man because he loves stories. And that's where I've come to it. And in regard to your philosophy of mind course and what is the nature of the self, well, I think, again, David Hume probably said it best, that, he said, whenever I look inside of myself, I never find any underlying thing. It's always just immediate, specific impressions and sense data and so on. But where I've come to it is, I think that this is a theater that we're in, that these are the movies. And Ellie said, as I said, God made man because he loves stories. And I think, what is your personal identity but your story, right? Is like what Tricia Barker is, basically, is the story, a story. And you're
Yes.
watching the story. And God's watching the story too. Yeah,
Right.
I sort of figure God is watching all the different stories and watching how they weave together too, which must be pretty amazing
It
movie.
it must be. And that was one thought that I had. That was my first thought when I came back to this body is the nurses were feeding me ice chips and I had to say my name. And I said, I remember her name. And they said, no, you have to say her name, or you have to say your name. But I kept calling myself her because I felt like I was a consciousness way outside of this body that I now had to inhabit again. And it felt like something I was just going to put on a costume for a while, and it didn't feel like
Yes,
me.
yeah.
And so that identity changes, I think, for near death experiencers. We do feel that limitation in coming back.
There was this wonderful woman I knew in New York. She was an actress and she was famous for playing a certain role. And um, after my book was published, I forget when this was, maybe 80s, or um, she had contacted me, and I met her in New York. She told me about her near-death experience, and she was famous for playing a certain role. And what she said, and I've heard this from other actors and actresses as well, the same thought. But she said that in her near-death experience, as she was struggling to find something in her life to compare what she was experiencing in her near-death experience, she said her mind went back to the night that she walked off the stage after playing that role for such a long period of time. And that night, the way she felt like leaving that role behind, she said that was the experience she had had in her life that was most comparable to that experience in her near-death experience, that you immediately lose your interest in that body that you have been so attached to for such a time, and that your mind immediately shifts over to another state of existence.
And that kind of leads me to ask you more about. I know that you do some work with hypnotherapy and with past lives. And personally, do you want to share some of what you believe or what you think in that area?
Yeah, well, I am a Humean, not because I got that stuff from Hume, but more that I remember when I started reading Hume as an undergraduate philosophy major. That's what I thought anyway, but um, Hume said, the great skeptic, he said that he felt that the only kind of afterlife that a philosophical person could entertain as a possibility would be reincarnation. And he doesn't really go on much as to why he thought that, but I think the same. I mean, I don't know it's the only one, but what I would say is, yeah, I think that there is something like reincarnation, although I think that we have to be aware that we might not be able to, the symbol systems that we use to think about it may not be valid within that next state of consciousness, right? So that we're just, but yes, and I should say that having gone to the University of Virginia, I knew some of those people like Ian Stevenson, who was the great psychiatrist who studied reincarnation. And I must say that I loved Ian dearly, and I'm not talking behind his back because these were the kind of conversations we had, but I don't think Ian, his version of scholarship was that if you got the footnotes right, everything was okay. But Ian just wasn't the best on critical thinking, especially if it was something that he believed or thought anyway. So I don't get my take on reincarnation from the experts. I get my take on reincarnation from my kids. And because my wife and I have two adopted kids. You met one just a little while ago. Carter is now 20, and he's Mexican-American by heritage. We adopted him from Kerrville, Texas at birth. And my daughter, Carol Ann, now 17, is a Blackfeet Indian from Montana. We made a bond with somebody on the reservation, an official there, and we just been very blessed to adopt at birth a Native American daughter, which is, I tell you, that's an adventure. I'd like to write a book about that one day. You know what
Well,
you say? She learned how to read somehow at age 6 before she went to school, and she started reading all these books on Pocahontas. Then one day at age 6, she looked at me and my wife like this, and she said, "Were your people English?" But also, my wife and I don't talk religion. We don't take these kids to religious services. And we don't talk about life after death. We talk about what's for dinner, like what's the homework of the kids. And I mean, that's my profession and something I avoid when I'm home. It's just when I'm away that I'm talking about this stuff. So, and having these kids, Carter came along when I was 54, Carol Ann when I was 57, I guess. So, you watch at this age, and I know they weren't tainted by any religion or anything, but both of them have just spontaneously um, related past lives. And again, out of just Carter, when he was 5, we were sitting on the bed and watching TV, and I was using the remote control to flip through channels. And when I flipped through one particular channel, Carter became very animated and talking, chattering away. And he said, Dad, that's my village. I said, what? So I flipped it back, and it was a National Geographic special on Chinese village life. And he started saying, yeah, I said, it's in my village. Before I came to you and Mommy, I was in China with my other mommy and daddy and my brothers and sisters. And so he could tell that I was incomprehending. So as though to orient me, he said, yeah, and then I was up in the trees watching you and Mommy lying in the grass. And I knew exactly what he was talking about because 5 years before he came in, Cheryl and I were in Greece, and we were at an archaeological site, and we were exhausted from the flight over. And so the attendant said, just lie down in the grass there and take a nap. And there were trees all around, and we were lying in the grass, and the topic of conversation was adopting a baby. Okay?
wow.
Then my Native American daughter, probably 8 years ago, just on one of our long walks, said out of nowhere, I don't like this place, plainly meaning the world. And so I was startled, and she went on to say, she said, when you die, you just go up and you be with God until all the people you know while you're alive have died. And then God sends you back as another person. And I said, well, what makes you think that? And she pointed inwardly just like this. She just said, I know in my mind. And she said, and I was with God, and he pointed you out to me. And he said, you got to go down to be his daughter. And I said, well, how did you feel about that? And she said, oh, I didn't want to do it, but God pushed me. She's twice with her hands like this, pushed me down to be your daughter. And I said, well, are you glad you came anyway? And she said, yeah. Well, my philosophy and Cheryl's philosophy is we don't talk to them about this stuff. I mean, they tell us stuff, but you're afraid that if you ask them questions, that would shape it. But
Right.
it's very interesting that maybe because we don't ask questions, they remember these things. And I took Carol Ann, my daughter, to Japan about a year ago, and teenagers don't like to sit on the same table with their parent, but I heard her sitting at a nearby table describing this memory she had of,
Wow.
and so, which is very interesting because I had two wonderful sons. I have two wonderful grown sons who are on their own now. And I had always wanted a daughter. And yet my wife at that time it was probably not the best thing for her to have another child. And so in spring of 1981 or 82, I was sitting on my swing in my back porch in Charlottesville, Virginia, and kind of realizing that a biological daughter was not in the offing. I entertained a fantasy of adopting a Native American daughter. And
Hmm.
it wasn't like a prayer, it was just a little, and I never put any other effort into it, but it's just like 19 years later, it just sort of
And
came about with, yeah.
what a beautiful story. Thank you for sharing those with me. I mean, those are the kind of stories that touch the heart because they have this emotional appeal, they have synchronicity, and I love it that you didn't try to shape their views by talking about these things because you easily could have, and then you would wonder if you planted the idea of reincarnation in their brain and it evolved very naturally. I really was taken by your daughter's thought about not wanting to be here on Earth. And as a near death experiencer who talks publicly now, I get a lot of people asking me about suffering. That seems to be one of the main reasons that people come to near death experiences, either grief or loss or personal suffering and a wish for healing. What do you think is the purpose of suffering, and what have you seen a connection in interviewing near death experiencers and the suffering and the joy of the afterlife, the suffering that people speak of and often come to question?
Well, it's a little bit of shocking and maybe sounds a little bit irresponsible for a person who has a PhD in philosophy and taught philosophy for years, and then a medical doctor and psychiatrist and forensic psychiatrist, as I was for a while, that I wouldn't have an opinion on suffering. But, I remember I had that. It's one of the papers I wrote as an undergraduate. I remember I, I don't know what the purpose of suffering is. Um, but it seems to be part of the dramatical format of life. I'm not sure that we would be a would there would a life with no conflicts and no difficulties, what would that be like? I can't even imagine. And the way I think of this, Tricia, is for many years I have asked people, let's say that you were diagnosed with some terrible infection that required you to be isolated on a desert island all alone for 10 years. And let's say that they could take you out there in a cargo plane with all the food and water and medicine you would need for 10 years. But they had a additional room in the cargo plane where there was room for like a DVD player. And let's say 5,000 DVDs. And so what I'd ask you is, would you choose all comedies? Now, over the years I've been asking that question, only 3 people have told me that they would choose all comedies. And so then I said, so would you choose some tragedies too? And they say, well, sure. And I said, well, when you were out there on that desert island watching the tragedy, would you be crying? And they say, well, sure, that would be the purpose. That's the purpose of a tragedy. So what I would say is that when I try to imagine it myself, let's say that I was in a state of consciousness, that I knew that I had many lives to live. From that state of consciousness, I would choose all kinds of suffering. As a medical doctor, at least in my case, when you hear people describing all these unusual symptoms and so on, you really want to know what that feels like inside. I remember being so curious. Some illnesses have such very unusual symptoms, and you really would like to know what the inner world of the patient is with this.
I've heard
And
that
so
I've heard that in medical school people feel like they have all different kinds of things
they
that they
do. That's right. Yeah, that second year you have all the illnesses.
you can be a
And
young man with menopause, right?
that's right, exactly. So what I would say is, when I outside of this framework, when you're inside this framework, you're not wanting to choose suffering. But when you're outside of the framework and know that it's a temporary thing, I can imagine that you might like to have various kinds of suffering, um, because they say it's a learning experience, and I can say that I have learned from my illnesses. Absolutely, I can.
Yes, I think too that you describe that perfectly. It's almost like part of a play. It's part of what we choose, and it's also a test of our spirit. So I've suffered greatly in this life, and I've felt that every time I've overcome a difficulty or I've gotten beyond a particular setback, I feel that I'm so strong, and I see people crumble with much less. And I think, oh no, try harder. There's this part of me that wants people to rise to the challenge. And I think that's part of life is if you rise to meet this really difficult challenge, then you can bring others along with you and show them how to do it and how to overcome it. And it makes for really the best stories. At the end of it all, I look back and I go, well, I'm grateful for my suffering. It's made for such a good story. I wouldn't be an artist, I
Yeah.
wouldn't be a writer, I wouldn't be many things if it wasn't for suffering.
Yes, yes, likewise. I mean, as unpleasant as the suffering I've been through was, in retrospect, I see that I've learned from it. Yes, yes.
Right. And we help others who are struggling in the midst of it to perhaps get through it quicker. That's what I look at as this progression of life. That's maybe part of evolution, is if I can get through it this quick, someone else down the line can get through it even quicker, and that we're helping one another evolve in a sense.
Oh, great. Yeah, cool.
So I
Cool.
have some questions that I wrote down. I heard you talking in an interview once, and you said that sometimes people listen to near death experiences and they just stop. They're just pleased with the story and then they're done with the story. And you think that they should keep talking about the concepts behind this, that it's
Yeah.
very important. So could you elaborate on that?
Yes, again, this is Plato. Plato first pointed this out in the book that has influenced my life more than any other, which is Plato's Phaedo, which is reflections about the afterlife. And in the real world, there's never been anything that got beyond the Phaedo in terms of his articulation of the problems. But what Plato pointed out is that when you're trying to reason about the afterlife, he said there's always got to be a storyline, because the notion of an afterlife is so obscure and even self-contradictory to most people. Life after death, that's a self-contradiction, really, and the meaning of the words. And so he said that there's got to be some story, and we're in the same situation he was, and the same story. It's like and the story. People knew these stories of people who almost died and returned and had these experiences. But Plato also pointed out that even if you had a billion stories, it wouldn't add up to a proof of an afterlife. That what you need is some set of concepts that can lead you from the narrative reports of the experience to the statement that there is life after death. And that's what we still lack. And another difficulty here is see that you obviously enjoy conceptual thinking, having taken a philosophy of mind course, and I enjoy conceptual thinking, and I suspect that you would agree with me that you and I are very rare, right? That to my astonishment, most people don't like to think of concepts and think through arguments and reasoning. Tell them stories and they're happy, but trying to get a concept across and their eyes sort of roll back in their heads. And So that is basically what keeps this from ever coming through to a satisfactory resolution. That in order to think logically about life after death, which people at least think they want to do, and if they do, if they really want to do that, then what's required is to reformat your mind, which actually requires thinking through some pretty, some concepts. So,
So,
and that is the difficulty. And so,
so let's lead some people in that direction. So, say that we're talking to an agnostic, and they always put forth, it's so boring, the same argument of, oh, this is just the brain shutting down, and, maybe consciousness stays around a little bit longer. What kind of concept would you give, granted, a fairly smart person many times who's agnostic, to better understand the afterlife?
um, well, let me ask you this. Um, I could send you my manuscript about this, and you could think it through and see what you think. It sort of takes some time to do, but I would love to do that
Yeah.
and see what you think about it. But basically, what I think is that what you have to do to be able to think logically about life after death is that the logic that you and I are using right now as we're thinking is based on literal meaning, right?
Right.
And that's because of Aristotle uh, codified logic, and the statements that you use in logical proofs are like literal true or false statements. But the trouble is that when we talk about life after death, we're not talking in a literal mode of language. That when you say, for example, that there is life after death, if you unpack the literal meaning of that, it is there is life after the final irreversible cessation of life, which is a self-contradiction. So what we need to do is to reformat our minds to think logically about not just self-contradictions, but all the many other kinds of nonsense there are. And it seems so counterintuitive to say that there are kinds of nonsense, but I have identified over 70 different types. Here are three. Listen to these. 'Twas brillig and the slithy toves did gyre and gimble in the wave. You can tell that's nonsense, but that's one kind. But now listen to this. Holiness breeds the vestigial lipstick of spontaneity. That's yet another type. Or now listen to this type. That cannibal you men just ate was the last one in this county. That's yet another type. And so it turns out that by reformatting our mind to think logically, because nonsense, just like literal language, is a rule-governed activity. It's governed by rules, just like regular, meaningful language. And so, when we reformat our minds to think logically about nonsense, then we come back to the question of life after death, and it lights up. You see it in a whole different way. So if you would be willing to plow through my book, I would love to send it to you.
Oh, yeah, that would be very
Then
interesting.
we
And
then we could have another conversation, and you could say, but I would greatly appreciate your comments on
oh,
it.
yeah. And as you were talking, I was thinking maybe it's life after body, in the sense that, the body dies, but there's still life that is out there. There's still consciousness. So that after body experience is maybe what needs to be focused on in the language. But also, as you were saying, the three different types of nonsense, one was clearly humor. So humor can be a form of nonsense. There might be
Oh,
different layers of it.
absolutely. Kant said, as a matter of fact, he thought that whenever anything is funny, there's always an element of nonsense in it, he said. But yeah, I would love to do that. So I'll get that sent to you, and then we can. Then, if you're interested in it, then I'd love to hear your what you think about it, because
Yeah.
I think that we are into a whole new era now on how to reason logically about this really big question.
So do you think poetry is also another way to talk about the near-death
Exactly.
experience. That's
Exactly. As a matter of fact, I have many cases of people who, in their last few hours or days of life, recited poetry or sometimes made up poetry on the spot as part of the dying process. And the first case of that was reported by Plato. Socrates was doing that in the last days of his life. He was writing poetry, which was very unusual for him.
Well, I believe that it comes from a place of intuition, poetry. So it could be the soul's language at times, and so it could be the soul speaking to you. And my MFA is in contemporary poetry, and for a long time before I wrote the memoir about my near death experience, I only expressed spiritual things through poetry. That was my medium because I felt I could
And
be honest here in the South, you know, about some of these experiences and hide it in imagery and in the language of poetry. So I think maybe people feel safer expressing these concepts through
yeah,
poetry. Do you think that's part of it?
could be. So you must have been from where, upstate New York or the Midwest?
Oh no, I'm from Texas, so I still live in
Oh, you are.
Texas. Yeah.
Oh, so you're from Texas.
Yeah, I've moved around quite a bit, but I'm from Texas. So, yeah, the certain parts of the country are not as open to this kind of stuff. And, you know, the South is notoriously not, but I find that so many people are drawn because they secretly want to talk about these experiences. So they're drawn to, I'm sure, you and me and others.
Yeah.
So I do want to hear just a little bit more about the nonsense. So what is this
Good.
nonsense project? How did it start? Like, how did you
Well,
begin?
actually, this is my oldest project. When I was
Huh.
a kid, my first interest was astronomy. That's why I went to the University of Virginia actually to study astronomy. But when I was a kid, I realized that this world we're in doesn't make sense because it's like when you try to think about what size and shape this thing we're in is, it doesn't make any sense. You, if you try to imagine it ends in a wall, then you can ask what's on the other side of the wall. But when you try to think of it going on and on and on and on with no limit, that doesn't make sense either. So when I was a kid, I loved Donald Duck and Uncle Scrooge comics written by a wonderful Disney artist named Carl Barks, who inspired, among many others, Spielberg and Lucas were both
Yes.
inspired comics, and also Lewis Carroll through the Looking Glass and Alice in Wonderland, and also Dr. Seuss. So, um, to make a long story short, when I was a kid, I realized I was very interested in nonsense, and I realized there were different types of nonsense. So when I majored in philosophy, that nonsense is one of the big concepts of analytic philosophy. So I followed that up. I did my doctoral dissertation, and I've continued to work on this for decades. And basically now have published a book, which is published in France, but not in the U.S. I have apparently a possible publisher now. So. And it turns out that nonsense is a is not like, most people, if this is the level here of ordinary meaningful language, most people think of nonsense as something down here, like it's sublinguistic. But in actuality, when you think it through, you realize that nonsense is a more complicated modality of language, actually, and it's a higher level of organization of language. And so basically, I had been studying all this, and then when I went to medical school, I began to notice that patients with various kinds of illnesses, like delirium or intoxication by ethylene gas or mercury or various kinds of things, or severe stress, like people coming into the ER who are not injured, but they've had seen a horrible wreck or whatever, that people talk nonsense when they are ill. But what I realized was that the nonsense that people talk involuntarily when they are ill reflects the same patterns and types that that nonsense writers like Dr. Seuss write. So that's the insight I've been working on, and it's
Interesting.
really stimulating some interest. So I'm really
Very
happy
cool.
about this.
And I could see why France might be open to it because of all the surrealistic poets, and I
Exactly.
love surrealism, and so
And
that's
Dada, and that's right.
yes,
That's
yeah,
yeah.
ah, interesting.
Plus, they're into reason, whereas Americans we kind of left that side of life, but the French are still into reason. And yeah, what I'm so excited about now, as you know, working with Lisa, my friend Lisa Smart,
Yes, yes.
and I have a sort of internet learning portal that we've opened to teach people about these things, and
Yes, the
it's
University of Heaven. I was going to ask you a little bit about that.
yeah,
So, yeah.
yeah, it's www.theuniversityofheaven.com,
I
and I'm just really excited about this because at 74, it's kind of getting harder and harder to travel around. And I've always loved teaching. So opening up this portal on October the 30th, we're having a free webinar where I'm going to talk about the thought process that has led me to the thought that, yeah, to my astonishment, there is life after death. And then we're going to be interviewing all sorts of great people with near death experiences. Evan Alexander um,
yes.
will be the first one, and then we're going to interview lots of really great doctors who have had near death experiences or who have studied them.
And which is fascinating. And I know Lisa very well. She wrote the foreword to my book. And I am going to, this summer, last summer, I had the first annual Near Death Experience Summit. And I'm going to get
Oh,
together
that's
another
great.
group and run it through your website, which I'm so excited about because I think working together is just a wonderful way to bring more attention to these concepts and
Yeah.
to start interacting with the public.
Tricia,
And
Tricia, I want to thank you for that too, because, sadly, it's what has happened with this near death field, as you know, is that a lot of imposters and charlatans and so on and it's become for some people almost a religion or a religious sect or a cult. And so I think what you're doing is so refreshing that to look at this with a fresh approach. And I think a lot of the people in some of the organizations have their minds crystallized now. They have just this one way of looking at this that they developed back in the 70s, and they don't want to move beyond that. So the point of that long-winded dissertation is thank you for what you're doing.
oh, you're so welcome. Thank you for what you're doing too. And it's interesting to me why anyone would want to fake this or be a charlatan because those of us, I think, who have had a real experience can energetically tell, whether someone has had a real experience or not. So it becomes,
Yeah,
it's not something you can truly fake with and have that authenticity of
that's right.
after effects. So those after effects to me can't be denied, that I short computers out, that I, like my energy gets too high for things. I'm not contained within my body. And I think a lot of true near death experiencers have that phenomenon. That's
Yeah,
something I
I
would
think
love to
that
study.
yeah, I've seen the couple, and there are not many of these, but they do occur, and there's just a couple, three or four that I'm thinking of. But they always, whatever they're asked, they always give a definite answer, yes or no, whatever. And so, anybody who does that, you can tell they haven't really been there because it's people who've really been through this. They're very reflective and careful in what they say.
Yeah, because even experiencing the things that I've experienced, I can't say that definitively, it means this. I only know that there were light beings who work through the surgeons. They could have a multitude of reasons for being there. They could have a multitude of ways that they were helping me heal. I can't definitively say because it was so unusual. It was, outside of the context of what I experience in this reality. So yeah, there's always more questions.
That's right.
Right. And I did want to end with just one brief question. This is like from other people who often come to me and ask this question, but what do you think is the ultimate, from a philosopher's point of view? You gave me a question, or you answered beautifully my question about suffering. What do you think is the point of continuing to come back here and learn all these fractured lessons when everything is perfect and beautiful there? When I didn't want to come back from my near death
Yeah,
experience,
yeah.
it was love, it was
Um,
pure, it was wonderful.
yes, and I don't know the answer to your question, but I'm concerned about it in the same way you are, and I there's this thought in many cultures who entertain the idea of reincarnation that at a certain point you can kind of step off the wheel, and I am at that point. Yeah, I'm ready to step off the wheel. If I'm given the choice whether to come back along this rigmarole, I don't know that I would. And but it's just really interesting. And all of these things I'm saying, I am hedging to the extent that I realize that we can't really know from this framework, right? And
Right.
and my opinion may be very different when I get into a different framework. But
I
I just, what people tell me is that as soon as you're out of your body, you're into a timeless and spaceless framework, right? And for the rest of us, it's really hard to imagine what that would be like. And but I do know. I mean, I accept that. What can I say? Like I said, some of my best friends have been dead, and they are medical doctors. That if I, heaven forbid, if I had a medical problem, I ask myself, would I go as a patient to my medical doctor friends who've had near-death experiences? And absolutely, I would. So I trust their medical judgment. So what basis do I have to distrust their unanimous opinion they all had that what they experienced was another dimension of existence?
Yeah, yeah. Well, beautiful answer. Thank you for sharing your stories with me and a little bit of your research and interest. And I'm looking forward to reading your manuscript. I think it'll be fascinating.
Great.
Thank you. And I'm
Thank
looking,
you so much, Tricia. This has just been delightful. I'm sorry about my ineptitude with this equipment, but I'm glad it worked out like it did.
oh,
This is good.
yes, it has been wonderful. So I'm just going to end here and thank you, Dr. Moody, and thank you everyone for listening. Please check out the links to
Thank
University of Heaven below and the various places that I'll put below this video. And you can stay in touch with me and Dr. Moody through our websites.